My son said out loud, "We will take care of the old account tonight," and the word took my breath away. Where are you watching from right now? Tell me the city in the comments. My name is Sarah, and for 38 years I had built my life around Mark, trusting him with small things and the big ones, like a will and the key to my safe. By the time I heard that sentence playing from the phone left on the kitchen counter, I was already dialing a number I had saved for emergencies. I called a private investigator that same afternoon, and within 3 days we had cameras, bank subpoenas, and a plan that I would help execute. If this kind of story matters to you, please like and subscribe so more voices who were betrayed get heard. Now, come back with me to the exact moment the phone hummed on the marbled counter. The day began ordinary, with light slanting through the dining room blinds and the smell of coffee staining the air like a memory. Mark had been to my house that morning to pick up a box of old documents we had promised to sort together. He told me about a client at his job and about dinner plans with his wife, Elena. His voice was casual, the easy cadence of a son who knows he is loved. I made him tea and watched him fold into the life he had always wanted, far from my small kitchen table. I did not suspect, not even for a second, that the box he carried held not only paper, but a map to what would become a betrayal. After he left, I cleaned up and heard my phone vibrate against the counter. It was a group call that had been left open, and I heard 3 voices, one of them Mark, say words that made the room tilt. "We will take care of the old account tonight," someone said. And the word account was not about banks, yet felt like a ledger of intentions. My hands went cold. I think my neighbor Laura knocked on the door twice before I could make sense of it. I called Tom, the investigator, while my hands still shook. "Tell me everything you heard," he said, flat and precise. "Where are you now?" he asked, and I told him I was standing over the kitchen counter with a coffee gone cold. "Do not touch anything," he warned. "Lock the house, but do not change anything until I arrive." I remember the sound of his boots in the hallway when he came, the way he scanned the room with a practiced eye. He brought equipment and questions, and from the first exchange between us, I felt less alone. "Who else knew you had those papers?" Tom asked. "Just Mark and me, and maybe Rachel when she visited 3 months ago," I said. "Then treat everyone like a witness until we know."
"Otherwise," he replied. "I had hired investigators before for small things like locating a lost deed, but never had I set one on the trail of my own child. My background was ordinary in a way that makes betrayal slice deeper. I grew up in a small town where people signed names with pride and kept promises like heirlooms. My father was a mason who taught me that hard work and steadiness built a life. I studied accounting because numbers never lied. I married Daniel when I was 29, and together we built a modest home, a garden, and a quiet routine. Daniel died 10 years before the events I am telling, and I spent the inheritance he left us carefully, one decision at a time. Losing him taught me the value of documentation and the sanctity of a signature. I took night classes after he passed to become a certified bookkeeper, and I ran a tiny consultancy helping local businesses reconcile payroll. Losing Daniel left a quiet ache, but also a meticulous streak. I itemized everything. That habit, this obsession with receipts and ledgers, is what saved me from losing everything to a plan I could not at first even imagine. I am telling this so you understand why paper mattered to me and why the idea that someone could convert trust into currency felt like a violence. Tom introduced me to more people. There was Dr. Miller, who reviewed handwriting and helped us verify a false codicil, Officer Lopez, who would later take statements at the precinct, Rachel, my daughter, who lived across town and had come running, and Michael, my cousin, who handled some of Daniel's estate matters years ago. Elena was Mark's wife, and her name would bob in later interviews like a small, complicated boat. There was also a woman named Anna who worked at the bank and who, under Tom's questions, admitted to seeing transfers that did not add up. Each character appeared at different times and left fingerprints on the case that, once assembled, looked less like a family dispute and more like a calculated operation. The initial investigation was painstaking. Tom started with the phone. He copied files and created chain of custody records. He told me how important it was to maintain every metadata field and not to compress anything. Any tampering could make the evidence inadmissible, he said, and I remember nodding, though half of the terms were new. Tom's first day included visiting the bank, where Mark had power of attorney for my safe deposit box. "We need transaction histories going back 5 years, he told the clerk. The clerk, a woman named Anna, frowned and said there would be paperwork for subpoenas. That is when I met Rachel, who insisted on coming with me to the bank. At the counter, I watched Anna retrieve statements and point to a transfer labeled consultation fees that repeated every month. Consultation fees for what? I asked. Her eyes darted away. "I am only the teller," she said. Her voice smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee and fear. It was the first of many small evasions. Tom's method was methodical and slow in the way a surgeon's hand steadies before the incision. He had a way of asking the same question in different rooms and with different tone until inconsistency showed like a bruise. "Who benefited from the trust?" he asked me in the study while sunlight slanted across the desk. "Who signed the documents?" he asked at the registrar with a recorder running. "Who was present when the codicil was notarized?" he asked at the notary's office. Each time, the answer changed slightly. Mark told the notary a story. Michael said he had advised. Elena produced receipts for a home renovation that coincidentally coincided with several withdrawals from my accounts. I recorded each exchange. In one interview, I asked Mark, "Did you ever think about my safety?" He said, "Of course, Mom," and I quoted him verbatim into my notes. "Then why the accounts?" I asked. He looked at the pocket of his shirt like he was searching for an alibi. Our conversation that day became lines in a much longer sequence of interviews that, when edited together, felt like a play of intentions. There were 3 early moments when tension accumulated in the house like storm clouds. The first was when Tom left an evidence bag with a single receipt on my dining table, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The second was the night my safe would not open, though I had the code. And the third was the day Elena came to take my cat because she said it belonged to their household. I remember the sound of the lock clicking and my chest tightening like a hand had closed around it. I asked questions of people who knew Mark. I called his colleagues at the firm and spoke with his supervisor, a man named Daniel Reed. "Mark has been under stress," Reed said, "but he is reliable." I listened to the voicemail he left, and the phone hummed with normalcy while my inside unstitched. I visited the notary public, Mrs. Baxter, who made coffee and told me she remembered the day a man in a navy suit signed a document. "He seemed in a hurry," she admitted. Each visit added texture, a color or smell that later meant more than it did at the time. I began to collect the small things, the way a spider collects thread, building a web. By the time I had gathered enough to move to the next phase, we had 5 named witnesses who admitted to irregularities in bank statements and 2 documents with questionable signatures. Tom and I drafted a plan. "We cannot move until we have solid proof," he said. "We will set a trap that forces the actors to reveal themselves or to panic." I remember my hands steadying as I helped fold the script. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. He smiled, not a warm smile, but a strategist's grin. "Play normal. Keep Mark thinking he still controls the narrative. Let him come to you." That was harder than I thought, because Mark's presence in my home had always felt like safety. Now it felt like theater. We installed 3 hidden cameras in the house with consent from a judge for surveillance during our controlled time frame. The cameras were small black eyes nested in a bookshelf, a smoke detector, and a framed picture. I learned then about chain of custody for digital evidence and why timestamps are crucial. The footage was set to upload to a secure server with encryption, and we logged every access. The technical explanation Tom gave was simple and practical.
He said a secure forensic copy preserves the original data and creates a write block so nothing can be altered. Then an expert examines the copy for metadata, including creation time, modification history, and device IDs. If any file shows signs of tampering, the chain breaks and the prosecution loses leverage. We kept the house functioning as if nothing had changed. I made my usual dinners, watered the plants, and pretended to be surprised at Mark's stories. At night, I lay awake listening to the house breathe and imagining the cameras seeing me as both subject and investigator. There were tests we ran that were small and psychological. Elena received a text from an unknown number about a job opening in another state, and she read it aloud like casual catechism. I recorded her reaction. Mark mentioned that some papers were missing. I pretended to misplace a receipt. Each small move had its countermove. It felt like chess with the stakes raised to personal ruin. Tension moment 2 occurred in a restaurant where Mark and Elena met friends, and I sat with Michael and Rachel at another table with Tom watching from the corner. I could hear the clink of glasses, the warm smell of tomato sauce, and Elena's laugh, which used to reassure me, now sounded manufactured. Tom sent a message that quietly asked me to signal if Mark mentioned an account. I did, and what he said was a line we had been waiting for. He joked about closing old chapters, and a waiter served tiramisu with a candle, and the scene felt obscene in its normality. We needed to force a choice. Waiting had built time for the other players to move. Tom argued we force the event, and he convinced me. Set a dinner for the date they often mentioned. Let them show their hand, he said. We invited Mark and Elena under the pretense of a family anniversary. I prepared the table with the same placemats Daniel had always used and with the smell of rosemary in the oven. I wore the blue dress Daniel loved and tried to make my hand steady. The plan required precise timing. Tom would position
A support team outside, and Officer Lopez would be ready to secure any evidence taken from vehicles. We will not act unless we see an attempt to remove you or to administer something, Tom said. He handed me a small kit of materials that looked like medical supplies and explained simply how a sedative shows differently in blood screens versus hair samples. He said to note any sudden drowsiness and not to drink anything I had not poured. The dinner was a stage. Conversation moved through polite currents and occasionally struck a sharper chord. Mark asked about the will in a casual way, his voice casual like a spoon stirring coffee. Elena complimented the roast and asked about a document I had been meaning to sign. "Have you updated your beneficiary designations?" she asked. I answered with the practiced gentleness of someone who had been asked for a favor 100 times. Michael interjected, "Sarah, we can make all this simpler." His voice was oily, as if he had always loved smooth lines. "Simpler for whom?" I asked. "For you," he replied. The central scene, the way I remember it, unfolded with a choreography of speech and silence. At one point, Elena stood and offered to clear the plates. "Let me help, Mom," she said. I remembered Tom's instructions and watched her hands. She carried the plates in a way that placed her side of the table nearest the study where the safe sat. Conversation flowed around the table, and Mark joked about an upcoming conference at his firm. "You always plan to go," he said, and the word planned landed like a stone. I felt a wash of dizziness and knew that feeling from the night my husband died, a memory of oxygen thinning at the edges. I told myself I was imagining it. I tasted metal on my lips and heard the clink of a glass. Elena's hand brushed mine as she passed the wine, and she smiled in a way that felt like a ledger balance settling. Dialogue during that dinner was thick. Mark said, "You know how practical you have always been." I replied, "I kept a file for everything." He laughed, "Of course you did." Elena said, "We can help, Sarah. Let us take care of appointments, of the headache of papers." Michael leaned forward and said, "There is comfort in simplicity." Rachel, who had been quiet, said, "I just want everyone to be safe." Tom was in the next room via an earpiece, and I felt him breathe through the line. Then Mark stood and offered to get a bottle from the study. He walked past the safe, and his hand brushed the key that hung on a hook. At that exact second, I felt the room tilt, and I tasted copper again. I glanced at Elena, and she caught my look and smiled in a way I would later see on camera as practiced. The plan they executed was methodical. Someone distracted me, while another moved to the safe and attempted to extract papers and a small box containing an original codicil. At least that is what the footage showed. This is one of the deliberate tension moments I replay often. I remember the smell of lemon from the cleaning spray, the ticking of the kitchen clock like a metronome, the heat of the oven reflecting on the window, and the sensation of my chest tightening. I said aloud, "I am tired," and the room responded with concern. Elena offered water, and Mark asked if I wanted to sit. They were rehearsed in empathy. Tom sent a short, sharp message. "Act now," he said. I stood and said, "I will go check the laundry," and the movement gave them the window to act. When I returned, the safe was marginally open, and a slip of paper lay on the floor that was not there before. My voice in the footage is steady. "What happened?" I asked. Mark said, "We were only moving some things." I held my gaze to see if his face would break. It did not. At this point, the break in the crime unfolded like a trap snapping shut on its own. Officer Lopez and 2 plainclothes deputies entered the home with warrants in hand. The sound of their boots on my floor made my knees tremble. They announced themselves, and the room filled with a different kind of air, the kind that smells like regulation and fluorescent lights. "We have reason to detain you for questioning," one said to Mark. Elena's face went pale, and Michael tried to usher in legalese as if words could remove handcuffs. "You do not understand," he insisted. Tom showed the footage to a shocked face that became confession. "We found evidence that you planned to remove material from the safe and alter the documents," Officer Lopez said. The words seemed to carve the space between us. Mark's first reply was, "This is a misunderstanding," and then the tape played back with him saying, "We will take care of the old account tonight." They read him his rights and led him out with his hands behind his back. The sensation of seeing your child in cuffs is a physical shock whose outline I still feel when I close my eyes. Rachel screamed a short sound like a match being struck, and then let out a long, place-emptied sound. Elena wailed in a different register between surprise and calculation. Michael tried to make the deputies leave. "You are making a scene," he told them. Officer Lopez placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sir, you are also under investigation," he said. I felt unmoored, and then an odd clarity. The house was quiet in a way that signaled a past before the event and a future that would reconstruct everything. Once the arrests were made, the investigation widened like ripples. We discovered a pattern in the bank records where monthly transfers labeled as consulting fees
went to a corporation owned partly by Michael, and that Elena had been listed as a payee on several invoices. Additional victims came forward who said they had been promised internships, access, or permissions in exchange for signatures. An entire small network of favors, promises, and false affidavits showed up in papers that once looked innocent. Dr. Miller examined handwriting and said that a codicil had been added after Daniel's death that did not match his style. His report was concise and useful. He wrote that the signature showed differences in slant and pressure that were consistent with a traced or copied hand rather than an original stroke. There was a technical forensic explanation I must include because it became the backbone of the prosecution. A document forensic analysis compares paper fibers, ink absorption, and stroke dynamics to establish authenticity or forgery. Specialists use magnification and spectral analysis to determine if inks originated from the same pen batch and to detect layering that suggests a signature was pressed over a photocopy. When combined with metadata from scanned copies and witness testimony about who handled the documents, it becomes a lattice that either holds or collapses in court. The expansion of the case meant that 4 more names surfaced as possible accomplices. A retired accountant named Helen admitted to rearranging ledgers to make payments appear as routine. A young paralegal named Chris confessed to creating a template used to generate invoices. A courier named Julio revealed he had driven envelopes between houses without reading them. Each confession felt like a thread unspooling a garment made to fit a family of convenience rather than one of love. The trial was a public thing after that,
We sat in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and coffee and legal text. The prosecutor presented the evidence in a sequence that felt rehearsed and devastating. This was not an isolated act, she told the jury. This was a calculated scheme to convert trust into funds and to alter the course of an estate. The defense argued motive and misunderstanding, tried to paint my actions as overreaction, but the footage, the bank records, the handwriting analysis, and the witness testimonies created a pattern. Mark spoke at one point, and his voice broke in ways that made me remember his childhood laughter. "I was trying to help," he said, and then later he testified to the meetings where words were spoken about accounts and transfers. He said he did not intend harm and that he thought it was pragmatic. The prosecution then played the audio of 2 phones in a room where Elena discussed how to clean up the beneficiary list. The courtroom shifted and a hush fell like snow. One of the procedural explanations that was important was how the prosecution used subpoena power to obtain bank records and how they authenticated digital files. In simple terms, the process requires the bank to produce original ledgers and for a forensic accountant to match transaction fingerprints. With account activity, each transaction is traced with timestamps and routing numbers. The prosecutor must show a continuous chain from the origin of funds to the recipient and prove that signatures or authorizations were procured under false pretenses. That documentation and testimony is what makes the case prosecutable. Tension moment number 3 came during cross-examination when Mark was asked if he ever thought about his mother as something to be managed. He lowered his head and the courtroom air tightened. The jurors leaned forward as if closer to hear a secret. My heart pounded like a drum in a distant room. The exchange lasted 6 minutes and felt like 6 hours. "Did you ever believe the inheritance was owed to you?" the prosecutor asked. He answered, "I believed I had a right to it," and the words were small, but they contained the whole geometry of greed and expectation. When the verdict came, it was both a collapse and a benediction. The jury found Mark guilty on counts of attempted fraud and conspiracy, and several accomplices were convicted on related charges. Sentences varied, with some receiving community service and restitution orders, and others receiving jail time. The judge, Judge Ramirez, read his decision with a gravity that felt like a scale balancing. "The court finds that these acts were an abuse of trust," he said. Restitution was ordered, and a civil process moved to recover assets that had been improperly transferred. The aftermath is where transformation began. In the months that followed, I learned what people mean when they say justice is not a thing that heals everything. 1 month after the verdict, I opened a small office that I used to run my bookkeeping and added a consultation service for elders. I named it Legacy Watch, and it was a space where people could bring their concerns about wills, powers of attorney, and suspicious transfers. I worked with Helen, the retired accountant, who agreed to volunteer 1 afternoon a week. I held a small meeting with community leaders and explained how to recognize red flags. The first month was about anger and paperwork and long nights on the phone with lawyers and bank officials. Friends like Laura and Rachel were constant and practical. They came with coffee and patience and a willingness to sit in silence with me. I wrote a short op-ed in the local paper about financial abuse and heard back from 2 neighbors who had stories and wanted help. The first month taught me that action mattered and that a plan could turn fear into a framework. 3 months later, I was giving a talk at a community center about detecting elder financial abuse. The room smelled of tea and disinfectant, and many people introduced themselves with small confessions. "My uncle was scammed," said a man in the front row. "My neighbor had someone who did similar things," said an elderly woman. I presented a checklist we had developed with Tom and with Dr. Ramirez. Miller about documenting meetings and keeping copies of any financial instrument. The checklist included simple steps like having 2 independent witnesses for major changes to a will, keeping an independent lawyer in the loop, and maintaining separate accounts. We also explained legal options and how to secure temporary protective orders while an investigation proceeds. The 3-month mark was when the community began to understand the mechanisms of betrayal, and we started to see people come forward to report suspicious activity. The momentum felt fragile but real. 6 months later, the restitution process had begun to show results. Several bank accounts were returned, and a fund was established to help pay back costs to other victims. I had started a hotline on Fridays with Officer Lopez and Tom where people could call for advice. The office had become an anchor, and the volunteers had grown to a small team, including Rachel, Helen, and an intern named Chris, who had once worked on the invoices but now wanted to help undo the damage. I found myself teaching others how to interview a suspect, how to preserve an email, how to order a certified bank ledger. The community responded with donations, and a local law firm offered pro bono hours. I met other women in similar situations, and together we began a small support group called Safe Hands. The 6-month mark was when my grief had not vanished but had been partially rechanneled. I felt both lighter and more burdened because new responsibilities had found me. There were moments of regret and of surprising tenderness. Mark called a few times from a cell, and we spoke with legal rules in place. He said he was sorry in a way that asked for forgiveness and not punishment. I thought I could solve things, he said. I thought I knew better. I told him I wanted honesty and I wanted him to participate in restitution. He agreed. Elena was ordered to repay funds and to attend financial counseling. Michael faced the harshest sentence among the adults who orchestrated transfers. His pockets had been deep with the currency of relationships, and his punishment included restitution, a suspended sentence, and community service. The law did what it could. The sentences on paper did not fix everything, but they provided a ledger that returned some balance. I kept a file labeled evidence and another called restoration. In restoration, I cataloged the accounts returned, the program started, and the people helped. I filed the small checks and the emails of thanks. I kept photographs of the first meeting where 10 people came to learn about their rights, and of Helen and Chris smiling over forms. Each photograph was a proof not of innocence, but of reassembly. One of the most important technical details that helped was the forensic accounting work that traced funds through shell companies. It required subpoenas to the payment processors and cross-border inquiries where funds had been routed to accounts with names that
Suggested business names but were actually personal vehicles. Forensic accountants used bank routing numbers, payment timestamps, and correspondence to link payments to the defendants. This documentation proved essential in court and in civil claims. In the quiet evenings, I still sometimes hear Mark's childhood laughter and the memory of him handing me a crayon drawing. He is still my son. I visited him once in the facility where he was serving part of his sentence. We spoke about small things and about the future. He asked for a book and for photographs of home. I left a small stack of letters that I had written to him in the weeks after everything fell apart. He read them later and returned one with a shaky sentence that said, "I want to be better." I keep that letter folded in a book on my shelf. There were practical outcomes that mattered as well. Judge Ramirez's ruling included an order for restitution and mandated that Mark attend a financial ethics program. The bank agreed to change some of its internal protocols around power of attorney and to require an independent review for large transfers from estate accounts. The local elder care coalition took our Legacy Watch program and integrated it into their resources. I testified at a conference and spoke as a witness and a survivor. The things I could not change, I turned into measures that might prevent others from falling. Justice had several faces. It had the slow face of court rulings and the immediate face of returned assets. It had the social face of conversation and the bureaucratic face of changed banking policies. For me, the most meaningful measure was the hotline calls that started to come from people who learned from our materials and prevented a fraud before it happened. One woman called to tell me she had refused to sign a document because one of our red flags matched her situation. She saved herself thousands. The smallest practical victory felt as weighty as a sentence in court. In the end, my life was altered but not erased. I reopened my consultancy with a public-facing service for those worried about estate fraud,
And I partnered with Tom and Dr. Miller to create a workshop series. We produced a simple booklet with the title Signs and Safeguards and distributed it at senior centers. I have been invited to speak at a conference where judges, bank representatives, and community advocates share best practices. My role changed from passive caretaker to active coordinator. I now wake early, check emails related to Legacy Watch, meet with volunteers, and call families to advise them on how to document unusual requests. The routine keeps me busy, and because of that, the sharpness of Betrayal dulls slightly. If you are still here, I will say this plainly. Trust is not a contract you sign and then forget. Trust is a daily act, and it requires both courage and caution. Do not confuse love with permission. Protect your papers, keep copies, and appoint someone independent to review major changes to your will or powers of attorney. If something smells wrong, investigate it. You do not have to do it alone. If this story touched you, consider subscribing. We are building a community and a resource hub for people who need evidence-based guidance when relationships and money intersect in dangerous ways. Share this story so others can recognize the signs before they become a ledger of loss. Some games end, others simply change boards and pieces. I chose to change the rules. Thank you for listening.